The woods on the back end of the Callaway property had been swallowing things for a long time. Not violently, not suddenly, but in the slow and patient way that Tennessee timber does. A little more each spring, a little denser each fall, until what had once been a clearing at the edge of the back pasture was now 40 yards inside a tree line that nobody had pushed back in 3 decades. Ray Callaway knew the sawmill was back there somewhere. He'd known it his whole life, the way you know about a lot of things on a farm you grew up on, not with any detail or precision, just as a fact of the landscape, something that existed in the general inventory of the place without demanding particular attention. His grandfather had run it briefly in the late 1980s, milling lumber for a neighbor's barn project and a fence line renovation on the home place. Then something had broken. Ray had heard different versions over the years, a bent saw arbor in one telling, a cracked frame in another, and the machine had been pushed to the edge of the clearing and left. That was the early 1990s. Ray was a child then. By the time he was old enough to go back in those woods on his own, the mill was already half consumed by the growth around it. He'd thought about it periodically over the years. Not seriously, just the way a man thinks about the unfinished items on a property he's responsible for. He'd walked back to look at it twice in the past decade. Once about 8 years ago when he was doing a general survey of the back property after inheriting the farm from his uncle, and once about 3 years later when he'd gotten a vague idea about clearing the wood line back for additional pasture. Both times he'd looked at the machine, noted that it was in rough shape, and walked back out without making any decision. It was one of those things that sat at the bottom of a long list, never urgent enough to rise to the top, never invisible enough to forget about entirely. The thing that changed was not ambition or planning. It was debt. Ray Callaway had been farming that ground seriously for 11 years by the time the situation forced his hand. He ran a cow-calf operation on about 300 acres of owned and leased ground, supplemented by hay production on the flatter fields and some row cropping on the leased ground to the north. It was a legitimate small operation, the kind that requires constant management and produces a living that is real but not generous, the kind where a bad year doesn't destroy you, but 2 bad years in a row will make you sit down with a piece of paper and start doing math you'd rather not do. Ray had just come through 2 bad years. A drought year followed by a year in which he'd lost more calves than usual to a respiratory illness that had moved through the herd in early spring and cost him not just the animals, but the veterinary expense and the time and the toll that kind of loss takes on a man who works with livestock. He was not in crisis exactly, but he was close enough to it that the distance made him nervous. The equipment situation was the part that kept him up. He'd been renting a tractor for planting and haying from a neighbor 3 miles down the road, a man named Curtis who was generous with the machine but had his own operation to run and his own schedule to keep. The arrangement had worked well enough when Ray's timing and Curtis's timing didn't conflict, but in 2 of the last 4 seasons they had conflicted, and Ray had planted late or hayed late or done both. And late timing in either activity is not an abstraction. It shows up in yield and quality, and ultimately in what you get paid. He'd been telling himself for 3 years that he needed his own tractor. He'd been telling the bank the same thing. The bank had been telling him to demonstrate more consistent cash flow first. That conversation had been going in circles long enough that Ray had mostly stopped having it. It was his wife Karen who brought up the sawmill. Not in a strategic way, not as a plan. She brought it up because she'd been listening to Ray talk about the equipment problem for 3 years, and she'd run out of new things to say about it. And one evening she simply said, "What about that old sawmill your grandfather had back in the woods? Is that worth anything to anyone?" Ray said he honestly didn't know. Karen said maybe you should find out before you rule it out. That was the whole conversation. But it stuck. He went back to look at it the following Saturday morning. He took a chainsaw and a brush hook and spent 2 hours clearing his way in to where the machine was sitting. It was in worse visible condition than he remembered. The wood components had largely rotted away, the belt housing was collapsed, and the whole structure had tilted several degrees as the ground beneath one side had eroded over the years. But the main frame was iron, and the iron was still there. The saw carriage was still there. The log deck supports were still there. He spent another hour clearing vegetation away from the machine itself and photographing every component he could identify. Then he went home and started making phone calls. He didn't know where to start specifically, so he started generally. He called a farm auction house in Cookville that he'd used before and described what he had. The man there said portable sawmills had some collector value depending on age and manufacturer, but that he'd need more information before he could say anything useful. Specifically the manufacturer's name and any model or serial number visible on the casting. Ray went back the following morning with a wire brush and spent an hour cleaning cast iron surfaces until he found a manufacturer's mark on the main frame, bell saw. And below it, a model designation and a partial serial number. He photographed it and sent the images to the auction house. The auction house called back 2 days later with a name. There was a dealer in East Tennessee, they said, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who dealt in antique and specialty farm and forestry equipment, and who also moved Massey Ferguson used equipment as a secondary line. The auction house had no specific knowledge of what Pruitt might offer for the machine, but they said he was known for making straight trades when the equipment suited his network, and that if the bell saw mill was as intact as Ray's photos suggested, it was at least worth a conversation. Ray wrote down Pruitt's number. He called Pruitt that same afternoon. Pruitt listened to the description, asked several specific questions about the condition of the saw arbor and the frame integrity, and asked Ray to send the photographs. Ray sent them within the hour. Pruitt called back the next morning and said he wanted to come look at it. Ray said, "Come ahead." Gerald Pruitt arrived on a Thursday morning driving a diesel pickup with a long flatbed trailer behind it, which Ray took as a sign that the man was not coming just to look. Pruitt was in his late 50s, heavy-set, the kind of man who moves around equipment with the practiced ease of someone who has handled a great deal of iron over a long career. He shook Ray's hand, exchanged the minimum of pleasantries, and asked to be taken directly to the machine. Ray walked him back through the cleared path to the wood line. Pruitt spent about 50 minutes with the mill. He brought his own tools, a wire brush, a small pry bar, a flashlight, a magnet. He worked methodically from one end of the machine to the other, checking welds, testing the integrity of the main frame castings, examining the saw arbor housing with particular attention. He found the manufacturer's data plate on the underside of the carriage frame and spent several minutes cleaning and photographing it. He didn't say much while he was working, and Ray had learned from watching his father deal with equipment traders that silence during inspection was not a bad sign. It meant the man was concentrating, which meant he was interested. When Pruitt finally straightened up and turned around, he looked at Ray for a moment before saying anything. Then he said, "This is a bell saw Model M, probably 1958 or 1959, based on the serial range. The arbor housing is cracked on one side, but it's a clean crack, not a catastrophic failure, which is consistent with your family's account of why it was parked. The main frame is sound, the carriage is intact, the log deck is gone, but the support iron is all there. For a machine that's been sitting in a Tennessee wood line for 30 years, this is about as good as you're going to find." Ray asked him what that translated to in practical terms. Pruitt said he had a buyer in his collector network, a man in North Carolina who had been looking for a complete bell saw M for several years for a working restoration project on a heritage farm property. The crack in the arbor housing was not disqualifying for that buyer. He had the machinist relationship to repair it properly and the interest in doing so. Pruitt said, "I can't tell you what my arrangement with that buyer looks like on my end, because that's my business. What I can tell you is what I can offer you on your end, and I think it'll be worth hearing." He offered 4 Massey Ferguson tractors and a grain drill. The tractors were 3 MF 1700 series utility machines and 1 MF 4700 series, all late model, all serviced through his dealership network, titles clean. The grain drill was a Massey Ferguson 9000 series, recent model, good condition. Pruitt said he could have the equipment delivered within 10 days of signing and that he would handle the Sawmill transport at his own expense. Ray stood in the wood line for a moment and did not say anything. 4 tractors and a grain drill was not a number he had been prepared for. He had gone into this hoping, at best, for a cash offer that might cover a down payment on a single used machine. What Pruitt was describing was the entirety of the equipment problem, solved in a single transaction. He told Pruitt he needed a few days to think it through. Pruitt said that was reasonable. He left his card, shook Ray's hand again, and drove back down the road with his empty flatbed trailer. Ray spent 3 days going over the proposal the way a careful man should. He called the Massey Ferguson dealership Pruitt was affiliated with and verified the relationship. He looked up the equipment values independently. Used MF 1700 series utility tractors were trading in a range that made the aggregate value of what Pruitt was offering significantly higher than anything Ray could have financed through the bank on his current cash flow profile. He had Dale Fricke. No, this was Tennessee, not Kansas. He had his neighbor Tom Wicker, who had been farming 40 years and had a sharp eye for equipment deals. Come over and look at the proposal paperwork and the listed machine specifications. Tom looked it over carefully and said, "The only way this doesn't make sense is if something's wrong with the machines. Get the service records and have someone look them over." Ray asked Pruitt for the service records. Pruitt provided them without hesitation, which Ray took as a good sign. Tom Wicker reviewed them and said the maintenance history was consistent and legitimate. Ray called the farm equipment lawyer his father had used once on a land contract dispute, a man in Cookville named Harlan Briggs, and had the trade agreement reviewed. Briggs called back the following afternoon and said the agreement was straightforward, the terms were clear, and he saw nothing that concerned him. He said, "If the machines check out on inspection, I'd sign it." Ray signed it on a Monday morning at his kitchen table. Pruitt witnessed it and left a copy. 10 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon, the first delivery truck came up the Callaway Farm Road. The 4 Massey Fergusons arrived over 2 days, the grain drill on the 3rd. Ray and Tom Wicker went over each machine as it came off the truck, running through the inspection checklist Tom had written out by hand on a yellow legal pad. Fluid levels, tire condition, hydraulic function, PTO engagement, hours on the meters against the service records. Every machine checked out. The MF 4700 had a minor hydraulic leak at a fitting that was fixed in 20 minutes with a wrench and a new O-ring. Everything else was clean. When the last machine was parked in the equipment shed and the delivery driver had gone, Ray stood in the doorway of that shed for a while and looked at what was in front of him. 4 Massey Ferguson tractors and a grain drill, lit by the late afternoon light coming through the shed's west-facing gaps. His own equipment, free and clear, no payment, no interest, no bank conversation required. The total value represented on that shed floor was more than he had been able to borrow 18 months earlier when he'd made his last serious attempt at financing a single used tractor. Tom Wicker, standing beside him, said, "Your grandfather would have a hard time believing this." Ray said he had a hard time believing it himself. Tom said, "Well, believe it. It happened because you didn't haul that mill to the scrapyard 10 years ago when you could have gotten maybe $400 for the iron." Ray thought about that for a moment. He said, "I never hauled it because I never got around to it." Tom said, "Sometimes not getting around to something is the smartest thing you do." The sawmill left on a Saturday morning 2 weeks after the equipment was delivered. Pruitt sent a crew with a crane truck and a heavy flatbed, the same way Earl Denton's steam engine had left his Kansas property, slowly, carefully, with equipment that respected the weight and age of the thing being moved. Ray watched them work the machine out of the woodline on a path they'd cleared the day before, the crane lifting the main frame assembly clear of the root structure that had grown around it over 3 decades. It took most of the morning to load and secure. When the truck finally pulled out of the farm lane, the back pasture felt different, in a way Ray couldn't quite articulate to Karen when she asked him about it that evening. He said it felt like something finished. She said, or something started. She was right, in the practical sense. That spring, Ray planted his hay ground and his row crop acres on his own schedule with his own equipment for the first time in his farming life. He used the MF 4700 on the heavier field work and ran two of the utility tractors for the lighter tasks, bush hogging, fence work, moving round bales, that had always required either renting Curtis's machine or doing the work at the wrong time. He used the grain drill in early September for a winter cover crop on the fields he'd been leaving bare, something he'd wanted to do for years, but had never had the drill to do it with. The cover crop came in well, and he kept it in his rotation going forward. The cow-calf operation stabilized that year and improved the year after. Some of that was the cattle market recovering from the softness of the previous 2 seasons, but some of it was operational. Ray was managing his ground better because he had the equipment to manage it on the schedule the ground required, rather than the schedule he could afford to rent around. The hay he was putting up was better quality because he was cutting it at the right stage of maturity instead of waiting for Curtis's tractor to come available. Better hay meant better cow condition going into winter, which meant better conception rates, which meant more calves the following spring, which meant the numbers on the operation started moving in the right direction after 2 years of moving in the wrong one. The bank noticed, not immediately, but by the end of the 2nd year after the trade, Ray's cash flow picture had changed enough that the conversations with his lender had a different tone. Not easy. Farming conversations with banks are never easy, but different. The lender said something changed in your operation. Ray said, I got my own equipment. The lender looked at the balance sheet and said, that'll do it. There were people in the county who heard the story of the sawmill trade and reacted the way some people always react to a story of unexpected good fortune, with a reflexive skepticism that is really just envy wearing a reasonable face. Ray heard through the community grapevine that at least one person had said, yeah, but how often does something like that happen? How often does a piece of junk in the woods turn out to be worth 4 tractors? Ray didn't respond to that directly when it eventually got back to him, the way these things do in a community where everyone knows everyone. But he thought about it. The honest answer was, not often. You couldn't build a strategy around it. You couldn't tell your son to leave broken equipment in the woods and wait for a dealer to come along. That wasn't the lesson. The lesson, if there was one, was something more fundamental and less convenient than that. It was about the habit of not being hasty, about not converting every non-productive asset into its lowest immediate value just because that conversion is easy and the asset's future value is uncertain. Harold Denton hadn't known his steam engine was worth 11 Massey Fergusons. Ray's grandfather hadn't known his broken sawmill was worth 4 tractors and a grain drill. Neither man had made a calculation. They had simply not made the opposite calculation, the one that says, this is broken, and in the way, and the scrapyard will give me something for the iron today. So that's what I'll do. There is a particular kind of impatience that comes with financial pressure, and it is one of the most expensive habits a farmer can have. When money is tight, the instinct is to liquidate anything that isn't producing, sell the non-working equipment, cash out the marginal acres, simplify the operation down to what's clearly functional. Sometimes that instinct is right, but sometimes what looks like dead weight is just weight that hasn't found its purpose yet. The sawmill in the woods was not an asset Ray could have used directly. He had no milling operation, no customer for lumber, no practical application for the machine in its broken state. It was, by any ordinary measure, worthless to him. Its value existed entirely in relation to someone else's need, someone else's vision of what the machine could become. The trick was simply to not destroy it before that relationship could be established. Karen put it more plainly, the way she usually did. She said, your grandfather left that thing in the woods because he was busy and it wasn't urgent. You left it there because you were busy and it wasn't urgent. Between the two of you, you managed to not make a decision for 30 years, and that non-decision turned out to be the best decision either of you ever made. Ray laughed at that, which was the right response. She was right, and she knew she was right, and the only appropriate reaction was to acknowledge it and be grateful for it. The grain drill is still running on the Callaway farm as of the last season. Ray discussed it with Tom Wicker. Two of the MF 1700 utility tractors have been traded up as the operation has grown, and Ray's position has improved enough to allow for planned equipment upgrades rather than emergency solutions. The MF 4700 remains the primary workhorse of the operation. Well-maintained, reliable, the machine Ray reaches for when the work matters and the ground conditions require something that won't let him down. He's put significant hours on it, and he treats it accordingly. Fluid changes on schedule, filters when they're due, a look-over before any major job. The kind of attention that keeps a piece of iron running long past the point where neglect would have ended it. The clearing where the sawmill sat has been cleaned up and incorporated into the back pasture. The ground is productive now, running a small group of stockers in the summer months, contributing to the operation in a way it couldn't when it was overgrown timber edge. The indentation where the mill frame had rested for 30 years is gone, erased by several seasons of grazing and growth. There's no visible sign that anything was ever there. That's how land works. It takes things back, covers over the evidence, moves forward without sentiment. But Ray Callaway knows what was there, and he knows what it became. And on the days when the farming is hard, which is most days, when the weather doesn't cooperate, and the cattle prices disappoint, and the equipment needs something it didn't need last week, he walks out to the equipment shed and looks at the machines that are there, because a broken sawmill sat in the woods for 30 years and nobody was in enough of a hurry to haul it away. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is the kind of thing a man can build a farm on. He drinks his coffee, starts the Massey Ferguson, and goes to work.